All right. Good morning. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm managing editor of Australia Institute Press, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Australia's biggest book club for today. I'm coming to you from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. It's quite grey out there today, but the land is very grateful for the rain that we've been having lately. Sovereignty was never ceded on this land, and I'm grateful to the First Nations people who've been taking care of this place for many, many millennia. Uh, you can register for upcoming webinars from the Australia Institute on our website www.australiainstitute.org.au. A few reminders: you can type your questions for Tyree in the Q&A. You can upvote people's questions if you really like them. Remember to keep things civil and on topic in the chat. Otherwise, Hannah will boot you out. And this is a live event and it is being recorded. The website will be at the website. The recording will be available on our website afterwards. So it's a real pleasure to be welcoming Tyree Barnette today. He is a transplant to Sydney. He's originally from Raleigh, North Carolina. You can correct me on my pronunciation in a moment. He moved to Sydney with his partner in 2013. They have two boys now. And Tyree's day job is at Western Sydney University working in student services. He's a member of Sweatshop Literacy Movement, where he's written pieces for SBS Voices and contributed to anthologies such as Love, This Little Red Thing, and Racism, stories on fear, hate, and bigotry. And his first book is called Stolen Man on Stolen Land, which is the subject of our conversation today. Welcome, Tyree.
Thank you so much for having me, Alison. Greetings from the Willamatigal lands of the Durick Nation here in Sydney, and I'd like to pay my respects as well to elders past and present, and extend my welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or other Indigenous peoples joining us this morning.
Thank you. So this book, Stolen Man on Stolen Land, it obviously is fitting that we start with an acknowledgement of country as we do every time, but in particular for this book is important. So the book is about your experience moving from America to Australia. You deal with all sorts of questions, including racism, what the sovereignty of the land looks like coming in as an outsider, what it means to choose to have a family here, and lots of interesting comparisons between contemporary United States and Australia. So let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us about how you came to move to Australia in the first place?
Sure. So as is detailed in the first chapter of the book, my wife works in clinical research, and so we were looking to move abroad. We just wanted experience at the time, a life experience, as well as a bit to put on our resumes. And so we looked at different countries, and we settled on Sydney in particular versus Melbourne because we just simply knew more about Sydney, saw beautiful pictures of the Opera House and the Harbor Bridge. And we're also looking for somewhere that at the time, us being Americans are very sheltered. We don't get out there much to the other parts of the world. We didn't want such a big culture shock. And so Australia seemed like a pretty good move with a similar kind of obviously English being the primary language and similar culture as well to America. And so it seemed, even though it was as far away as you can get from Raleigh, which you pronounced correctly, in North Carolina, it seemed like the best fit for a short stay for us. So as detailed in the first couple of chapters, outlines the move. That's how it happened.
Mm. And you start off in the barbershop. So there's this sense of, the barbershop as being a place for community, for coming together, for sharing experiences. Uh, can you talk about, and the book has a beautiful kind of arc where you start and end in a barbershop. Can you talk about, what people thought when you told them you were moving to Australia and what people's responses were like?
Right. So the dialogue in the barbershop is kind of an amalgamation, and some of it kind of fictionalized and embellished a bit, but it does represent what people initially thought, as well as what other Black Americans who moved to Australia, either temporarily or permanently, what they also heard from their community as well. And so in general, I remember telling my grandfather, and he was just kind of shocked. He said, "You're moving where?" Um, because as I said, a number of Americans, a sizable amount of us, don't really travel abroad a whole lot. And then when it comes to Black Americans, I know we are growing as a population that travels abroad and that has more spending power in other countries in terms of tourism. But otherwise, like I said, we don't get out much in America. And so um, people were initially shocked, surprised, wondering why. Some were excited, some were confused. Um, some people probably got it mixed up with Austria.
Okay.
And so there was so there was all kinds of mixed reactions, but probably overwhelming feeling was curiosity. A lot of people were curious as to why. And then, the next assumptions came out of, oh, well, you're probably going to see kangaroos everywhere, or you're probably own a boomerang, or whatever else Australia exports that America consumes. Or is there an Outback Steakhouse? Or do they have Foster's beer? Because those are the brands that are pushed in America as being uniquely Australian, when that's clearly here, that's not the case.
Mm. Except for if you live in Canberra, which does confuse people a little bit because you might arrive in Sydney and see a sort of metropolitan place. But if you come to Canberra, it's not infrequent that I'll see a kangaroo driving home from work. So
Mm,
it's a little bit different here. They call it the bush capital for a reason, I think.
there you
Um,
go.
and so, one of the things that you talk about in the book is when Obama was elected, and this sense of hope, this surge, the idea of possibility. Um, but then it was after you had moved to Australia that Trump was elected for the first time, if I have the timeline correct.
That's
Um,
exactly right.
can you talk a little bit about the effect on sort of you personally, but on how you read the American psyche to go from, a president like Obama to having Trump as president?
Sure. So me personally, I felt a just deep sense of disappointment. We had we knew that for his first term, Hillary Clinton was his opponent. We know that she wasn't a perfect candidate. You rarely ever get a perfect politician. In our two-party system, you really only have two choices. Yes, there's a third, independent party running, but they're never a major factor in winning the election. They more influence votes, as in taking it away from one part or another. And so I just felt a deep sense of disappointment, a deep sense of we could have had even better. We could have kept moving forward. We could have actualized how we think of ourselves in terms of America being the shining beacon of democracy to the world, and how we're exceptional and how we're innovative and how, we're fair and free and the best, most powerful country in the world. We could have actually put um, further effort into actualizing that belief in what we tell ourselves. But instead, we decided to go backwards. And so, getting to your question about the American psyche, I guess it's hard for me to or point out just one, I guess, particular um, reason or kind of where America's head is. Part of me believes the country just doesn't believe that better can happen. Like they don't believe that, for instance, universal health care can actually be a thing.
Mm.
They're afraid that it's going to mean longer lines at the hospital. It's going to mean longer wait times for surgeries and procedures. I think there's a lot of misinformation, and because there just is, social media and people not watching news, not reading. And then we've seen the rollback of fact checking on social media and the rise of AI. It's just getting worse. So people are getting all sorts of wrong and conflicting information. And so they're making wrong and poor decisions. People aren't as engaged in their politics in America either. They only really pay attention when there's a presidential election. They don't turn out as much for local or municipal elections or off-year elections. Um, I find here in Australia, because it's compulsory, that people do come out and vote, even if it's just for day of, oh, you look good, or I like what you said there, I'm going to vote for you, sort of thing. They do come out. And so there is that lack of being politically active and aware outside of the elections. Um, and I think finally also it's Americans being so kind of for mass capitalism and not realizing that there's already elements of socialism built into the country that sustains, things like food stamp or SNAP benefits, Medicare, schools and school funding. That's all kind of from a community pot for the most part. But because capitalism, and we're seen so much as a capitalist-based country, that just clouds people's judgments and causes them to think that anything that's a compromise to capitalism, anything like a Zohar Mamdani, who's a democratic socialist, is dangerous, is, going to propel us backwards, and that we're not Europe, freedom, freedom, freedom. And so there's just this misunderstanding of what better looks like and what better can tangibly be for the average person there.
Mm. Yeah, the compulsory voting system is something that a lot of people in Australia are really proud of, and
Mm,
it's one of the things that we often point to as being one of the reasons for a level of moderation in Australian politics.
hmm
Although things are looking a little bit worrying at the moment with the polling that we're seeing for One Nation. Um,
mm.
from your perspective, one of the things that you talk about in the book is going to a Black Lives Matter protest in Australia. Can you tell us a bit about what your experience at that protest was like, what your expectations were going into it, and then what it was like when you were there?
Sure. So my expectations were I didn't really have many at the time. I just wanted to go support the movement, especially here in Australia, and I wanted to learn more about how First Nations populations here, their cause and their reasoning for adopting Black Lives Matter and promoting it further in Australia was, of course, to address Indigenous deaths in custody, whereas in the U.S. it was just police violence and police murder on citizens that weren't always just black or brown; some were white as well. And so I wanted to educate myself on what was happening on the ground here in Australia so that I could become a better ally so that I could also speak back to the people at home about, look, Black Lives Matter is beyond U.S. shores. It's here in Australia. Here's what it looks like, and here's why it's happening. And so, yeah, my initial expectations were I just wanted to go and learn. The experience that I had there and kind of my, I guess my takeaways were that it is a diverse coalition of people represented within the Black Lives Matter movement in Australia. Of course, with Indigenous Australia is making up about 3% or so of the total population. You need, more, and you should have more than Indigenous populations leading those sorts of uh, causes and those sorts of protests. Matter of fact, it should be everyone else getting involved because it is an Australian problem, not confined to Indigenous Australia and to First Nations people. And so I was very pleased to see a rainbow coalition, as the late Jesse Jackson would have said, of people actively at the movement and supporting and educating and showing up and being present and also appearing on media and the news to raise awareness of the issue. And um, so that was a great experience. And from there, as you said, I've tried to capture that in the book, and capture how the movement was started and how it's used in Australia and what its end goals are so that people back in the US and people here as well can recognize that this is an ongoing issue and is symptomatic of a greater sustained inequality over generations of Indigenous people, and that we still have a long, long way to go.
Mm. Absolutely. And so I think one of the interesting things about your book, especially for Australian readers, is having the opportunity to see Australian culture from the outside. And so your reflections on Black Lives Matter are really interesting for that reason. Um, I think one of the trickier things that you engage with is the question of different kinds of privilege that people might have.
Mm,
And so, for example, you talk about it being, being an American here, and if you have dealings with police or, say, other people in positions of authority, what that might look like for you. And you tell a story of when you're moving and what happens when you're moving house, a run in with a neighbor, and you're not sure how it's going to play out with the police. Can you tell us that story?
Sure. So yeah, the chapter is called "The New White," and it basically is, as you've described, we are moving house, and we get a moving truck, and the owner who lives on the property that we live on does not like that. And this occurred during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. And at the time, my wife and I did not have um, citizenship in Australia. We had an application filed, and so we were at a position where if we had any sort of legal infractions or anything on our record, such as what could have occurred, um, that it would impact our potential citizenship. We thought at least. And so we were in a very vulnerable, precarious situation. And so the chapter outlines how the power of the police state can be brought upon people of color at any time, and how depending on where you are in the scale of privilege and kind of what your background is, that pain could be greater or lessened. Um, in terms of, I guess, our privilege as being Americans, Australia is enamored, I think for a good word, about America. The American soft power here is very strong. And it's obviously the two countries have had a long-standing close relationship, even through Trump's first term and into his second term. It's still been positive or at least neutral, not negative, from my understanding. And so, because we're American, we have that initial curiosity, if nothing else, I love your accent. We get that a lot. And then because we're Black American, and because Black Americans are kind of the trendsetters, I think, and the Toastmasters of what comes out of America as culture. You think of athletics, sports, music, movie stars, television, etc. A lot of a sizable amount of what comes out of America is Black American influence. And so we have that additional privilege of being Black American and being, I guess, at the apex of most people's curiosity about America. And also the fact that there's not very many of us Black Americans out here, it then becomes a more unique experience. Oh, I've never actually talked to a Black American. I've seen you on TV, I listen to your music. I may, buy some clothing that's influenced by your trendsetters, but I've never actually talked to anyone who's Black of America. So that's how the privilege can kind of play out throughout the book as well.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying about Australian perceptions, and I think that's changed even more under the second Trump administration. Australia Institute has done some polling, and we found that people were more afraid of what Trump would do in the world than Putin or Xi Jinping. So
Mm.
I think this relationship is undergoing a process of change. But I understand what you're saying. I mean, especially in terms of culture, Australians just consume huge amounts of American culture. It's also been interesting to see how tourism from Australia to the States has dipped so much over the past couple of years. So many people are choosing not to go, not just because they're worried about having their social media accounts scoured for evidence of, criticism of Trump, but also just broader questions of safety. Um,
Mm.
and so, on that topic of safety, you talk about the importance of choosing to raise children here. And your wife, Nia, I mean, I feel like I know Nia a bit after having read the book. Um, she's she's a character to me because I encountered her in the book. She's a human being to you, obviously. But can you talk a bit about what that decision was like to choose to have children here?
So in the chapter, Black Life is when we first really decide to have a child here. It just sort of happens. Um, so what kind of went through our minds, what we discussed in the chapter was that we felt a greater sense of safety as Black Americans here than in the US. Um, as I've said, my own experience being Black American and my encounters with the police are very different, are much more, I guess, neutralized, and much more of a dialogue. Um, than I would have had back in the States. As a Black American, I know it is totally different for Indigenous Australians, and their experience is very different than mine. And I've had other encounters with the police through no fault of my own, outside of what I wrote about in the book, and they have all been either neutral or positive or even helpful. Like the police have actually been helpful. And that is not something that we equate or we expect in America for police to act towards Black Americans. We often prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
Mm.
And so, because of that feeling of sense of safety, because of also the social safety nets, once we did have citizenship, we had health care, we had access to good public schools with good, passionate teachers, and we didn't have to worry should we send our child to a private school for a better education. It seems like there was much more attention put on the public education sector from my perspective in Australia. And so a lot of the, I guess, basic needs that we knew our child would need to have were here. And we also felt a great sense of financial safety. I talk about in the book as well. Well, actually, I think I mentioned it. Yes, I do.
Mm.
That I had paternal leave as a parent because I worked at a public university. I got 26 weeks of paid leave uh, for both of my children. And that is, I was so shocked that I didn't even tell people in the US that that's what was happening here because I felt like it'd be a sense of gloating or it'd be a sense of like, almost rubbing in their faces compared to the US, how we're just now getting to the point where women can get some maternal leave and fathers can get some paternal leave. To have that much leave for only having worked for 1 year at the university, I believe was a requirement. You get a half year off for having a child was incredible. And so based on all of those factors, it seemed like this was by far a better place to raise a child and to enjoy and to have time raising your child than we had in the States at the time. Things have improved incrementally in the States in regards to child rearing and raising, but there's still no universal health care. It's still going to cost you money to just have a child, whereas here, we walked out of the hospital and we have no bills. And I
Mm.
still can't get over that to this day. And it's
Mm.
been almost 9 years. So, yeah.
Yes. Yes. Much and all as there are problems with, Australian healthcare and Australian education, the fact that it is possible to do that is really important and a kind of a fundamental part. We need to make sure that Australia's institutions stay strong so that this continues. And I thought
Absolutely.
one of the really touching parts was when you were talking about your wife talking about statistics in the States where Black birthing parents are far more likely to die in childbirth or to have other complications than other people, and so that seemed like a really tangible, important consideration. Um, something else that I.
Exactly.
Mm. Something else that I think must be really terrifying for American parents would be thinking about school shootings and
Mm.
being worried about sending your kids to school. And Australia has really strong firearm legislation. The Australia Institute's been doing a bit of work to make sure that that legislation stays strong and that it's enforced, according to the way that it's actually been written. So still a little bit more work to do there.
Mm.
Um, I wanted to talk a bit about the writing process and, becoming an author. So you have been working in the higher education sector. You work with a lot of students, and, clearly you have an interest in writing. How was it that you first started on the process of coming to write a book?
Sure. So before the book actually took shape, I had written through the sweatshop literacy movement that I've been a part of for almost 9 years now, a series of articles. Some articles appeared in SBS Voices. Uh, Although that publication has now closed, you can still find the articles I've written either on Sweatshop's website or just Google as well. And so through writing those initial pieces, which the first one, which really garnered a lot of attention that I did not expect, was subtitle was something like being black and fetishized, my experience of being black in Sydney, basically. And that's really probably the genesis of where the book came from. A lot of the encounters and the concepts that I kind of touch on help form the basis of this book. And so through writing those initial articles, and as you mentioned in the introduction, contributing to sweatshop anthologies such as Love and Racism, Stories on Fear, Hate, and Bigotry, which you could also find at the sweatshop website. That's what initially created the building blocks for the book.
And
But in
before
all, it
you,
was a go ahead.
oh, I was just going to interrupt for a second to say, could you talk a bit about Sweatshop and what it is and what it
Sure.
does?
So the sweatshop literacy movement was born out of Western Sydney University, probably it may have been 15 years ago now.
Mm,
And it was started by Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmad, who's also a very acclaimed author as well. His fourth book, Bugger, is out now. And the idea was that he wanted to give marginalized, underrepresented populations, I say marginalized in terms of the societal sense, but very rich culturally and linguistically, uh, opportunities to write their own stories. We did not want, another white author writing about growing up Chinese in Western Sydney or what have you. Or Sweatshop rather, knew that people in Western Sydney were more than capable of writing their own stories, their own way, and they just needed mentorship, guidance, um, and information about how they could write, who they could write for, and then opportunities to present their work to publishers like Affirm Press, who ultimately published Stolen Mantle, Stolen Land, opportunities to have their work published and to have their unique stories and perspectives in own voice. Western, uh, the sweatshop movement centers own voice narratives as a way to propel literacy. And ironically, a lot of, or pretty much all of the sweatshops, uh, theories and how they began to do their work is based off of Black American literature, such as especially from bell hooks. And so, ironically, that's where they got their start from. And then a few years later, here I come to benefit from the organization as well as to be able to promote the work the organization does that's so vital in the literary industry in Australia.
mm, yeah. And so you were writing some of these pieces that were being published, and then was the book a sort of organic emanation from that?
Right. So I got a mentorship through because I was able to have a few articles published and they were well received and I was, showing promise and real talent and dedication as well. Dedication more than anything to writing and to the process. I was offered a mentorship with the Firm Press to then undertake about took me about 3 years, but 2 years of a mentorship to write a manuscript. And if the manuscript into the process was deemed to be good for a coherent book and that I was ready to have it published, I was then offered a book deal. And so the book deal happened about halfway into the mentorship. And thanks to the book deal and to a firm press and to Sweatshop from the start, I was able to then publish the book. So initially, it was just I'm writing because I enjoy writing. And then a book offer came along for me to actually write a book. And so then it became taking previous writings and previous entries into anthologies and morphing that into a coherent narrative that was, again, own voice, my experience, and my story from my perspective.
Mm. And how did you negotiate with people in your life? I've mentioned your wife a few times. She's an important character in the book, but your parents make appearances as well. Your good friends. How did people feel about being in your book?
Sure. So I learned a very valuable lesson of how to fictionalize and amalgamate and mask characters. And so the friends that are represented in the book are really an amalgamation or maybe an archetype or something of a series of people that I know. And so some of their personalities, some of what they say are molded into one person that will help drive the narrative. Um, my wife Nia in the book, she read a lot of the book before it went to print. She spent about probably 3.5 hours or so the day before I think the final draft was due, reading through it and ensuring that the way I presented her was that she obviously accepted that and had no issues with it. And so she had by far the biggest contribution to the book. And as far as my parents go, they were represented kind of just as they are. And so there wasn't really much of a need to get their permission, as I didn't, try to make them into people that they were not. But everyone else, definitely an amalgamation. My in-laws, I embellished a bit their personalities when we get to the chapter about where the heart is when we go back to the States for a visit. But otherwise, yes, I did seek people's, especially my wife's insight. But otherwise, a good tip for writing is to fictionalize the characters and just have fun. The less real you make the characters to your life, the more flawed, the more problematic, and just the more kind of outlandish you're allowed to be with them because they're not real people that you actually know.
Mm. And it might give you a little bit of wiggle room if ever there were to be concerns about defamation, for example.
Exactly. It's courtroom friendly.
Excellent. All right.
Yeah.
We have some questions coming in from the audience. So the first one is from Jim, who asks, how have your family and friends in America responded to your decision to move permanently to Australia? And any planning to join you here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. Thank you. So friends were excited and a little sad, to see us go. Um, but they were happy for us. They supported our move. Initially, I should say the move was not permanent. We initially had, as I covered in the first bit of the book, only planned on being here for a year or two, at the most 4 years, because that was the duration of the permanent residency work visa. It was 4 years. And so that was our initial plan. But once we got here and really liked it, and then just saw the U.S. kind of in decline, we thought that this was a better place for us. As far as family goes, I think that was the second part of the other question. How did family react to it? Um, my wife's parents, because she, as I mentioned, she in the book, her father is a former Harlem Globetrotter, as well as a former professional basketball player overseas. So they're used to moving around. She spent some years growing up in Germany as well. And so he's more of a citizen of the world. So he was happy and excited for us to move abroad. Um, my parents were a little less so until they came after we had our first child. They came to visit Sydney and to see our first son. It may have been not even a month after he was born. And they saw that, so they were there in time to see the midwife that I cover in the Midman to come to do home visits. And they saw the amount of postnatal care that Nia was getting here and just the amount of additional support that we were getting as parents here. I was able to take 4 weeks off immediately from work at my child's Quentin in the book, his birth. And so I was able to have that time with my newborn and to support my wife, who had obviously gone through a very laborious experience, even more so than what's covered in the book. And so that after my parents saw that, they're like, okay, we get it. We get why you're here. This is excellent. You would not get this in the US. They'd say, great, congratulations, back to work. Here's your bill for your baby. You know, go on. And so that was their reaction. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. A question from Betsy Dixon, who asks, what is your involvement with Indigenous organisations, causes, people? I'm in Canberra, but from my experience, Western Sydney is still pretty white. That's an interesting perspective. Or burgeoning South Asian. For context, I am a Black American born woman from the Northwest, born in the 60s, who has lived here for 30 years after marrying an Australian man. I hadn't heard of your book until I heard about this webinar, but I'm now keen to read it, she says.
Thanks, Becky. Or Betsy, sorry, Betsy was
Betsy,
it?
yeah.
Betsy, sorry, Betsy. So yeah, Western Sydney is actually quite diverse in population. It's got someone from virtually every corner of the world. To get into your question in terms of what Indigenous causes and organizations I'm involved in, um, I to this point am not directly involved in Indigenous organizations or causes. I am looking at finalizing another writing project on the side where I may be working with an Indigenous creative, where I will be exploring the intersections of Black American and Indigenous causes, cultures, civil rights, acts of protest. And I'll be getting this support and advising and interviewing from an Indigenous person so I can make sure that again, the story is told in own voice, my voice, and their voice, telling a story side by side. So while I haven't been directly involved in any organizations through my work at the university I have worked at, I've been able to support Indigenous students, to support Indigenous studies and support programs. As I've been identified in the chapter War Me / Welcome, I talk about the real experience of going to an Indigenous ceremony to open a new facility at Macquarie University at the time. And I also talk about, again, how I support through working within the university and student support Indigenous students. And so wherever I could, I would attend their events. I would read about their history. I am reading, continue to read about Indigenous history and 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 a more thorough history, I guess, than maybe what some people are taught in school, so that I'm more aware and better able to write um, better, I guess, better content that's more accurate in terms of my knowledge now and where things stand now. And I am looking to, yeah, of course, further my involvement in Indigenous causes and organizations wherever the opportunity pops up, and I'm able to contribute meaningfully to them.
Mm. One of the interesting components of the book was when you were talking about reflecting back on First Nations people in America after having had your experiences here. And am I right in saying that to a degree, it meant that you recast or reformed some of your thinking about First Nations people in the States?
The biggest difference is that in the U.S., First Nations people are invisible.
Mm.
It's only been very recently that I can even recall seeing, for instance, I'm just picking on media because that's what America exports to the world, mass media entertainment, that I recall seeing a very purposeful and intentional show, and I can't recall the name of it, so sorry, featuring First Nations people in America. But otherwise, they are quite invisible. Part of that is by design, unfortunately, and part of that is because, as a similarly to Indigenous Australians, Indigenous Americans were removed from their lands before white settlement, and so we're not always we as in, I guess, American society and whatnot aren't always aware of who the original landholders and original land caretakers were before settlement in certain areas. There could be, and because of also American and Indigenous wars, there were amalgamations of peoples and nations and tribes, so that it could be Algonquian, it could be Iroquois, it could be Arapaho, it could be a mix of all that used to occupy the land. And so that was probably the biggest, I guess, recasting and reframing that, wow, they really are invisible in the US, and it's by design and on purpose. And that we have, and it's slowly starting to change the things in the US do with with recognition of original landholders. We still have a long way to go as well. But that's my biggest takeaway in that there is a purposeful invisibility to Indigenous Americans.
Mm. Our next question comes from Pauline, who asks, what is your experience with the African diaspora in Australia, and in what ways have you observed their experiences differ from yours?
Yeah, good question, Pauline. So my experiences lately have been meeting others from the African diaspora in mostly kid-led activities, either through school or through birthday parties or other events. Um, and I guess getting to your question around differences in experience, I think it goes back to privilege of being of myself having privilege being from America, being from an English-speaking country, a westernized country, a civilized country, we'll put in air quotes, that uh, these systems and these westernized systems and constructs and processes of getting certain things like citizenship or filing paperwork or applying for a job are very familiar to us and to me because we did those things, same things back in the States. I don't know if my brethren from the African diaspora, uh, some would have similar experiences and constructs and approaches in their home countries, but I don't know that things are always as easy or as understandable to navigate, especially given that if your native language is not English, um, and then Australian English on top of that, it can be difficult to navigate for anyone. Um, in this case, we're talking about the African diaspora, for anyone to navigate um, I guess, society in Australia, in an English-speaking country, where there are kind of steps and processes and bureaucracies that you have to follow. I see that a lot working with in universities, working with international students, trying to get them help with extending their certificates of enrollment, or trying to get them help with understanding their requirements to study and understanding their need to go attend class and not miss class to be compliant with their visas. I see a lot of that kind of skills gap or knowledge gap that they have. And so that's been sort of my immediate observations of how things aren't as aren't as native or don't come as easily to them because of I guess the lack of very westernized, very bureaucratic, very I guess constructed approaches that are there. May not be the best approach, but that's what's kind of in place from my observation.
Hmm. Sylvia Vogel asks, do you have any concerns when you go back to the States to visit your family or friends, given the uncertainty for travelers?
Sylvia, my biggest concern is that, and this may seem minor, but it can be quickly become an issue. My driver's license has expired in the US, and I tried to renew it at my last trip to the US, but because of the cuts to public servants and public service in the US, there was an extremely long line outside the Division of Motor Vehicles. And so I did not have the time to wait to have my license renewed. I mentioned that because I would not be comfortable, even though legally, I can drive on my Australian license. I'm not comfortable to do that in the US because I don't know if I'm stopped for any sort of reason, and I could be stopped for any reason that my Australian driver's license will be accepted or believed by law enforcement. And so, yes, my concerns are mostly around being in Australia. I've kind of lost my sense of awareness, to some degree, my sort of heightened sensibility or sensitivity, maybe a spidey sense, to borrow a phrase that I would have as a Black American in America. And so there may be instances or situations that I'm not appreciating the gravity of because I've been away for so long. And then you add having kids and having to not only look out for yourself, but first to look out for the safety of your kids and your family, and then yourself. And knowing that a slip up, especially in this administration, could mean you might get deported, even though you're a U.S. citizen, to some uh, far away backwater. I don't know, wherever they deport people now. Um, and so all of that is of great concern to me. And so I'm needing to be much more purposeful and much more careful about how I move whenever I go back to the US. And I do desperately need to get my license renewed. So that's going to be the first thing I do when I step off the plane and not drive till that happens.
No matter how long that queue is.
Yes, I'll have to wait this time.
Right.
I'll bring a book.
Yes. Matthew Hilton asks, are you worried about the Trumpian path we are going down in restricting and punishing freedom of speech, especially for academics and authors? For example, the cancellation of Dr. Randa Abdul Fattah.
That's a great question, Matthew, and a great point. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Um, I was definitely following the Dr. Abdul Fattah situation. She was just up the street, actually, at Macquarie University, where I used to work as well, and I would see her also at some protests on campus for Palestine. And so I know she was a very vocal, has been a very vocal member of academia, as any academic should be. And so, yes, to answer your question, I am very worried. I think that the place for discourse and for unlearning and relearning is starts at the university and then can matriculate to the rest of society. And so, I think if you take that ability away from academia to have debates, to challenge and to unlearn and relearn and change your perspective of things, that you will not have enough mechanisms to push society forward. Because if academia doesn't do it, who else will? It may fall to the media, but media in many ways are advertising dollars and revenue and ratings to determine what happens in media. So that just leaves public media, which can be prone to administrations and the desire or the lack of desire to fund them. And so it really falls on, I think, the academic space to really have these debates and or to start these debates. And so another I've just misplaced her name, but there's another academic who is also a series of academics actually who have been unfortunately made redundant at universities like I'm picking on Macquarie because I used to work there, um, who have been instrumental voices, thought leaders, experts in their respective fields. In this case, I'm thinking of an academic at Macquarie who was a leader, a foremost leader in Middle Eastern studies. I think she may have been the only Middle Eastern academic in Australia who specialized in Middle Eastern studies. So that tells you a lot about the diversity or lack thereof of that particular area of study, if I've gotten that correct. And so, yes, I am very worried about the suppressing of dialogue and of debate in academics and how that affects wider Australian society.
Mm. Dion Davis says, I haven't started the book yet, so apologies if this query is answered therein. However, I thought to ask this after seeing Pauline's question. Is there an established Black American immigrant community in Sydney, and are you plugged in?
Mm. Dion's a good friend. No worries, Dion. Thanks for coming. Um, you know what? When I first moved here, there was more of a virtual presence, or like on Facebook, and there was more of an intentional virtual presence. And you would see that in person represented with things like Thanksgiving or Friendsgiving, or when the first Black Panther movie came out, there was an organized effort to get us all together to enjoy the movie or to see or do the thing. Um, I think over time, people have either some have moved back to the States or moved elsewhere. Some have had kids, and they may not have the time to organize things or to promote the organization of things. And then some people have just settled into their own friends groups, whether it be through friends they made here, friends they made at their kids' school, they've had kids, etc. So I think there's kind of been a not a dissolving, but maybe a shifting of having one central porta to having many people have their own, um, I guess, communities. And I do talk about communities and the importance of community in the book. Toward the end, when we have our first child, Quentin, I talk about the need to have community around him and to help us to raise him and to have representation within that community. And so that's kind of where things are going. I think people are now tapped into where they find community and those people that make up their communities
Mm,
within Black American diaspora. Yeah.
mm. Martin Keyes asks, does the US have anything like a welcome to country as we see here? And he likes the way that a welcome to country puts First Nations peoples first at gatherings.
I do too. And no, we don't. Martin, was it? Yes, no, I was covering the book again, pleasantly surprised at Welcome to Countries or Acknowledgement of Countries, which is what non-Indigenous people would do in terms of acknowledgements. No, and again, I have not lived in the U.S. for the last almost 14 years, but to my knowledge, and when I left there, there was not any acknowledgments, formally or informally, written or otherwise, for First Nations people in America. Part of that, a small part of it, a larger part of it is just racism and just, just lack of will. A small part of it is that there would have to be uh, some research and some confirming as to who or whom should be recognized as the original custodians of the land because they were all removed before, in many places, before a proper settlement. I guess notable exceptions I could think of maybe in, I think, probably the greatest city in the country in America, New Orleans, very partial to New Orleans, where there is a sustained and ongoing, I do touch about the magic of New Orleans a little bit in the book, a sustained and ongoing presence and representation of First Nations people in New Orleans. And so you see that coming out of the original Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans. You see those cultures, indigenous cultures reflected. But otherwise, what often happens in the U.S. is that First Nations people get together and they have their own, if you're Native American, your own powwow or celebration of your particular Native American tribe or culture or people. That's often done internally. And unfortunately, there is no wider recognition of the presence formally or currently of Indigenous Americans in America.
Mm. And we have time just for one last question, which is a follow-up from Betsy Dixon, who asks, do you feel that you need to connect to First Nations groups to show solidarity? If I am tying that back correctly to the earlier question.
Betsy, yes, yes. I think that and what I'm continuing to do on my path is just learning. So before you can become an ally, or what Alicia Garza from the Black Lives Matter puts, a co-conspirator, you have to first learn, understand, and oftentimes unlearn what you assumed or what you may have been taught about the people you were trying to assist or not assist, that you're trying to support and you're trying to show up for. So the first thing is to learn. Um, and I think one of the purposes of me writing this book is to encourage people to go further. I don't have the answers in this book. I'm probably not going to say a whole lot of things that you don't, especially in Australian, that you don't already know about Australia. You learn a bit about America, but I'm hoping this book acts as a catalyst for you to then go and do more research, more learning, more unlearning, and then get involved in the ways that you're able to and that you feel most comfortable and can contribute the most to. Sometimes contributing and being an ally or a co-conspirator is just showing up, being quiet, and pointing to the person, especially if there's media involved. And I cover this in a Black Lives Matter chapter within the book, pointing to the spokespeople who are indigenous, who are of color, who have that lived experience that should be talking and engaging with the media, and not someone who is from outside the culture, outside the people, who are just there just to talk or be seen. It's not your moment, basically. It's not a moment to be seen. It's a moment to be still, quiet, listen, and support. And sometimes supporting is just simply showing up.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for your generous reflections both on Australia and on the States. Stolen Man on Stolen Land, Being African American in Australia is out now by Tyree Barnette. Um, Thank you all for your excellent questions and for your chat as well. And just a reminder, next week is a sitting week. So that means the Australia Institute live blog covering all of the things that are happening at Parliament will be up next week. That's on our website, The Point, www.thepoint.com australia.com.au. Thank you again, and we'll see you all next month for the next Australia's Biggest Book Club. Bye.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks, everyone.